civilization is a constant state of activity. It's a constant state of active change, and volumes, depending on how you live your life, those volumes expand and contract, but everybody's has their own different expansion and contraction. And sometimes when we're brought together and there are these common moments like the pandemic, for example, there's a stronger sense of cohesion, which doesn't happen very often at this,
Yeah.
When, I think,
and it's global.
Yeah, it's global. And, I'm trying to think of other occasions where I've been involved in something where there was more than 1,000, it's like football matches and things. That's the, where you get that kind of representation of mass, maybe a traffic jam or something where we're all stuck in a traffic jam. There are those moments which are all, but this whole situation is a lot more expanded. It's a lot more integrated. And
that is really interesting, because it is really a traffic jam. It's a good analogy, I think.
I mean, that's,
I don't know.
Was it Carl Jung and his idea of collective consciousness? That idea in some respects that I hope I get this right. There's this kind of, in some respects, our understanding of the world in some respects is embodied and from generations before us. So we are, consciously consciously connected back in time. And I think, it's, I talk to my students about modernism, and the Spanish flu, the pandemic that happened after World War I influenced the energy in some, and the prior, the emphasis in some respects on health and good life and all this kind of stuff that came through modernist thinking was accelerated by that. And so you kind of think, well, actually, that could happen with us now. But I think the lack of tangible, the interaction of how we, the interaction of people, I think is going to have a longer effect than we anticipate. But then again, I mean, I know people.
When you think about, I guess when you think of.
But I know people have found love online. So, in this period. So you kind of think, well, actually, anything's possible, really. So, and I think that's the human race. We have this capacity just to keep on keeping on. So.
Yeah. I mean, I think the point about modernism is interesting, because you wonder how much of a kind of movement that follows an event such as the pandemic would also be generated by the dialogue between people and the conversations and the I don't know, cafe culture in Paris or whatever other forms of interactions that really fueled the modernism. And, we know Team 10 and all other kind of collaborative platforms that emerged. So it is also a question of how will we communicate, I guess.
Yeah. And I mean, but these kind of moments are also important because they document a period of time, and a state of mind, and a way of of reflecting. I mean, in the early parts of the pandemic, I was writing a daily diary, in terms of my own state of mind about what was going on around me, and and I haven't looked back at it, and I only wrote it for the first 3 months or whatever it was of lockdown, and I think essentially I was kind of going around and round circles, really metaphorically and physically, because I was basically stuck in a locality. I don't think I walked beyond 1.3 miles in a day. I kept this kind of weird circle, so I was able to go there and back or wherever it was in an hour. So I created this kind of new, very odd lockdown geography, and and I took photographs and stuff, and I've turned it into a little kind of online publication. But it was kind of, for me, it's a record of a period of time where you didn't really know what was going to happen next, you know, in that time. And I think they're important because we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know, we could have another, you know, who knows what could happen, you know.
All you can is record the present moment.
Yeah. And that's, you know, it's useful. It's useful.
And when did the breathing machinery idea come from? At what point did that?
Yeah, so that was breathing machinery was an open call for ideas. I think that was in May maybe, and and I had an observation of extractor fans still working during lockdown on my walks locally, and they were basically keeping buildings that were closed alive. And I found this in my mind, there was this kind of connection between the conversation that was happening about, you know, hospitals and ventilators, and then buildings and ventilators, and it just kind of linked. And so then there was this call through CRISAP, which is a kind of sound arts organisation, research cluster at research group at London College of Communication, and I had an idea and I pitched it, and I was selected I was one of the 12 selected, and I did this open call for everyone to kind of submit images, of which you're one of them. Of a ventilation extract with an onomatopoeic kind of tag, or, you know, onomatopoeic kind of description, you know, and so it created a little moment of collective focus. And I had some really amazing feedback from people that participated, you know, kind of saying it kind of raised their awareness, you know, heightened their sensitivity to the mechanical in an urban or rural context and stuff. So that was really, you know, and actually it started to kind of identify these kind of backspaces that we don't normally kind of see or experience and understand, and actually the importance of all these machinic processes in the life of the city. But at the same time, there was a number of them that were kind of nearly, you know, kind of quite old and decrepit. So they were making a lot more noise and all this kind of stuff. So it kind of revealed a lot more about how fragile the urban fabric is.
But I think what it also did, at least in my case, I think it indicated to me that there is a certain shift in the value of observation that happened during this during the series of lockdowns, that we've maybe all, and you know, some of us are architects. I mean, we are architects. We are kind of taught to observe and record things we see. But I think perhaps it's a change that affected everyone. That they actually started observing things and taking time to understand and process details of everyday life. Because again, there is this major shift to the focus on your everyday life.
But I think that valuing of everyday life, I mean, even just down to your own domestic setting, you know, in terms of, you know, you're using the same knives, the same cups, the same glass, the same, you know, you're using, you know, all these things, and suddenly, you know, things that you would only do occasionally because you're out and about, or you've got work, and we just leave things to, you know, you leave things to stack up for longer, and all these kind of small things. Suddenly, you're on it every single day, and you've been. And
they become a calendar. They become the calendar of your day, right?
Yeah.
So, like, I have 2 coffees a day. Now is dinner time. And it's like, oh my God, is this really my life? Counting coffees and plates and...
But I mean, there were friends of mine who were saying they were bored of, you know, they were so fed up with their crockery, you know, their cups and saucers and things. And I was just like, yeah, I can see that. I too am kind of, it's the same weight, you know, the same pattern on the mug, you know, and you're just like... But equally, I think that's the reason why I think for me, walking around the local area has been so important in understanding how the world is changing around us. So I think, you know, I think when the cars went, there was a stronger relationship to the sound of birds, and, you know, and suddenly you were noticing a lot more around how things were changing in terms of natural phenomenon. So, puddles and reflections and leaves and plants blooming and, or, the smell of cut grass and, all these kind of things. Suddenly, I know it all sounds very romantic and kind of, but at the same time, they actually become really important markers to say that we are still moving forward, because our daily lives are quite kind of, they're so entrenched in a particular kind of routine now, I'm finding anyway.
But a lot of your, I mean, even before the pandemic, you are a walker, right? You love to walk.
Yeah.
And has this now been a different experience? I mean, have you discovered parts of Hackney that you didn't know before?
Occasionally, but.
Or you just saw it in a more detailed or different way?
Yeah, I think it was in a far more detailed way. And as such, everyday life is unfolding in a kind of it's like a kind of diorama. You're suddenly, the world that you're in becomes almost like in a kind of dome, and you can kind of see it almost kind of around you, like a diorama that, I think I can't remember.
Like a stage set.
Yeah. And you're kind of like an actor in it, mm-hmm. and so, and actually, I mean, I've been doing little creative projects that, just things ticking over in my head and things, but they've actually become a lot more rhythmic, ritualistic. They've become a way of almost calming myself when the anxiety goes up. So it's been.
So it's actually meditative. It's a meditative process over all of these moments of the everyday.
Mm. So it's been that for me has been quite the revelation.
Yeah. And then, of course, one of your main subjects in the pre-pandemic world is the wayfinding and signage.
Yeah.
And I guess we've just been overwhelmed with instructions and signage.
I was pretty caught by the footprints, the indicators telling us how to stand and where to stand and all that kind of stuff. I found that fascinating. But also just the provisional quality of it, how to distance yourself and how to measure yourself and how to interact and things. I found it really interesting. And for me, I'm fascinated by these kind of patterns of time and space. Yeah, so that's kind of my curiosity, I suppose. But at the same time, I think these graphics, in telling us how to behave and how to interact and stuff. I mean, you normally see it in a hospital or in an airport. But suddenly now it's in our everyday lives. And you kind of suddenly think, well, I don't want it there anymore now. It's like, it's almost like I actually would like to be lost. I'd like to not be directed. I'd like to have I'd like to just kind of wander around and not be worried about whether or not I'm 2 meters distanced. I've reached that point now. So wayfinding for me has shifted across into kind of like being lost. I'm actively wanting
yes. Way losing. No, but I think that's probably what we need to do in order to, as a kind of eat out to help out 50% off exercise. The post-pandemic kind of exercise could be just to remove all the signage from everywhere.
But I think that's the thing is, if we've been stuck in this lockdown for so long, you could argue that we know the area so well that we no longer need signage. Who is the signage for? So it's just, he's kind of, it's not a real proposal, but it's just it's a fantasy of taking an idea and just kind of going, well, actually, we all know our local area that well. And it's almost like it goes back to how, if you think about before signage arrived, little small kind of villages and things would exist within themselves. They wouldn't need, you wouldn't need to go anywhere because everything is centralized. You've got your green, you've got your post office, the bakery, the butcher, and all these different, the fishmongers, the grocer, all that. They're all kind of based in one little area, and so that's your base. It's the basis of Miss Marple. It's an Agatha Christie. It's everybody, they know you, and why would you want to go anywhere else? So it's kind of it's an interest, and then when you do go, you embrace that sense of being lost. I don't know. I think maybe it's overstretched for being a fantasy. But you disappeared for a little while there, Marko.
I know, but that's what I said. Can you hear me now?
I can.
That's what I said. I said I have no idea what you said in your monologue, but I'll rewatch it, and I'm sure I'll enjoy it.
I don't know about that, but anyway.
I guess one of the things that was my kind of real thing that I was really keen to talk to you about was you were the first person I probably met when the first teacher I had when I came to the UK. I think you were.
Okay.
And I remember when you did one of the talks, one of the lectures, you presented this project, and I was a young architecture student. I probably didn't really I wouldn't even talk about what I imagine architecture to be at that point, but you presented this one of your projects, which was a field covered with blankets, where you basically created an event, actually.
So I was commissioned by Bon and Villoen to design a picnic blanket for a London Festival of Architecture event that they were curated or organising. And so I
just couldn't, at that point, that was the first encounter with that notion that architecture is not really what I thought it might be.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the first encounter. I was very confused, actually. I was like, how is this architecture? It just kind of left me very confused.
That's good.
But yeah, I mean, I think that was probably the purpose of it. So I'm just wondering how did you get to that point?
I mean, that's
yourself. How did you yourself realize that? Well, you were obviously educated, like you had years of education, but you also must have at some point realized that this is not enough. The way we perceive architecture is not enough.
Well, I think, I mean, the people that taught me were very much, support. I mean, I suppose that my preoccupation is occupation. I'm curious about people and the structures that we engage with in an everyday way, but at the same time, in both in a permanent and a temporary sense. So I've always had that kind of, I quite enjoy that kind of ephemeral questioning of what an architecture can be. I think when I was in my own undergrad, I was designing a cafe in King's Cross, and I think one of the things, I mean, I was so pedantic about the details that I even drew, I stipulated and drew all the condiments, so the ketchup, the mustard, the salt and pepper, and the cutlery. And so I was very clear that actually in my mind, this environment existed, not just for the space, but for the things that you're eating and the experience of interaction and how you feel comfortable. And I think for me, that's always been interesting. And I think the challenge for me as I've moved through is trying to find a space for that kind of thinking, and to find a space where I feel that questioning and that space can be, expanded upon, I suppose. And And it
because somehow the physicality disappeared.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it became
the focus on physicality.
Yeah, it became about the nature of how of a construct. You know, what exactly constitutes space, and that can now, you know, and so the projects in the continuous picnic, the picnic blanket project, that in some respects enabled it loosened it up so much that actually I said that it had an impact and people enjoyed it, and I think that was kind of important. It was important in terms of my own understanding of how I could practice as a designer, architect. You know, I started to question terminology at that point, I think, and that was, you know, 20 years ago now. So, but at the same time, I think, you know, I was doing, you know, theatre set design, you know, scenography in France. So I was kind of using economic found materials and things to create a kind of poor theatre language, which in some respects enabled an imagination or a space of the mind, a creative mind, to fill the gaps. And so then it starts to become this, you know, immaterial question, you know, and I think, you know, what exactly constitutes physicality in architecture. So, you know, and it connects up to, you know, immaterial architecture with Jonathan Hill and such, and obviously, you know, Oliver Ellison, and, you know, it edges off into, you know, there were kind of simultaneous conversations, all kind of, we're all kind of, I don't know, there was something, it all kind of chimed with me. And I mean, I remember in my undergraduate experience, you know, my undergraduate time, you know, Jonathan Hill was one of my critics, and he, you know, he asked me a fundamental question. He said, "Are you an artist or an architect?" And at that point, you know, 20 odd, I was like, you know, similar state to you, I think. If, you know, I didn't know what.
Is there a fair question to ask?
At that point, I think, you know, I was producing work that was, you know, you couldn't really, I mean, it was quite fragmented contextual work. So it kind of made sense at the time, and it still does to me now, to be honest. It still resonates in my head, especially now that my own practice kind of blurs somewhere between the two still. So
you do say that you were questioning terminology. So is this the questioning of terminology ongoing? Are you still questioning terminology?
All the time. And I don't think I'll ever have an answer.
So you must acknowledge that terminology.
So acknowledge which?
You must find a certain relevance. You must acknowledge terminology, I guess.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, at the moment, I call myself a practitioner.
Yeah,
and then the work kind of lives in itself. But, you know, but at the same time, you know, I don't really have. You can't say, oh, that's what he. I don't have an easy label. Let's put it that way. And to be honest, I quite like that. I jump about a lot. You know, I kind of move around, and, you know, and as I said, fundamentally the underlying principle is around patterns of space and time. So I'm kind of it's there. You know, I have a sense of what it is that I do, but then how that exists, it can be a, you know, for me that's the enjoyment. That's the positive thing.
Yes. And so where did graphic design come in? How did graphic design come into your work?
Yeah, it does, but it didn't dawn on me until I don't know, maybe a couple of years in, you know, after my own work. I was kind of, you know, I think I enjoyed kind of creating patterns and colors and, you know, that kind of thing. And it kind of, I think it just it enhanced and it enabled a greater accessibility, I suppose, of the work that I was doing. And at the same time, for me, it was very satisfying in the way that it kind of had its own identity as a space, as a construct, and that was something that in some respects people kind of appreciate. They acknowledged and it said they enjoyed it. So it's kind of, and that encourages you further exploration, when you get knowledge.
It's a communicate. Well, it's kind of what graphic design does. It's a communication tool, isn't it?
Yeah. But the wayfinding conversation in some respects has emerged over the last 5-6 years, because my work is kind of bridged into this kind of publication, maps, patterns, wallpapers. There's this kind of translation of a place and these ideas of patterns and space and time kind of coming through this.
Can we pick one, maybe?
Sure.
The latest one, was it the
latest one? So what
was the latest one, Ed?
So that was Breathing Machinery.
Northern Ireland.
Northern Ireland.
No. The what?
Oh yes. So I was commissioned to do a work and the International Literature Festival in Dublin, which would encourage and so it would encourage a slow reading of the architecture and the space. And so the idea of the work was that it would exist as a kind of loose checkerboard pattern, which would then, in some respects, start to visually disrupt, but also instruct a new way of kind of appreciating the city for the duration of the festival. And so it was a combination of blue squares, which I installed in 2 buildings in windows in the street side. So, which one was at the Irish Architectural Archive, and then the other was at the Irish Architecture Foundation. And then there were a series of billboards that were then installed across the city at locations that were undergoing urban change, but also in some respects were located next to quite significant buildings. And then there was also the intervention in the addition of new billboards, or the reconditioning of billboards on Grattan Bridge, which in some respects started to activate an existing infrastructure of benches and civic life, but at the same time, because they hadn't been, the highlight of them with this new pattern activated, encouraged people to use the benches a lot more for the period. So that was quite nice. But the whole thing was set up as 14 sites, which would then, in some respects, people could then walk through, and there was a kind of a map, kind of list of locations which you could then walk along and engage with all of them across the city. So it's about an hour or so walk. And but the graphic language came from, it evolved with the client, with the commissioners, and at the same time, it was very distinctively, it's quite bold visually, and so therefore you could see it from afar. You could also appreciate it up close because it was kind of had this kind of motif on it. So,
well, I guess it creates a network. It's a kind of way of establishing a network.
But it also, it's as a public in a public setting, many people would interact with it in many different ways. So some people would only experience one, and then others might experience 2 in completely different, in different directions from 2 different points within the period of time. And so in some respects, the geography of the city starts to become it suddenly, through this interaction, starts to connect up disparate parts of the city for no reason other than the work, which then in some respects starts to kind of raise questions about how we piece the city together and how we think about space and time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
but the work is quite complex in a sense. But it's quite complex in a sense, because how do how do you get to it? How do you develop such a multifaceted work that includes locations, graphics, on top of stories, on top of? Does that require you experiencing the city yourself?
Yes. So a lot of it's to do with me walking about and digging about in archives and having conversations with, public, but also commissioners and other stakeholders and things, and that also enriches the conversation and the overall work. And for me, that is as much the work as it is the actual final outcome. For me, I think the work, the final outcome is great, but for me, that it's the totality of, from the moment of someone initiating the conversation, where it gets interesting. And I think that's and I've been very fortunate with the commissioners that I've had, that they're up for that kind of question, because it is, as you say, there's a lot of things going on in it, and at the same time you could also just look at it and say, well, actually it's just a poster. So there's this kind of very, there's quite a simple underlying kind of identity to a work, which I think is important, because
But what I mean, another aspect of it that I think is interesting is that, in a sense, can you ever properly document it, or do you kind of have to let it do its own thing?
Documentation is one of my. I take shots, and and I've had photographers and things take photographs and stuff, but because the work is, the work is so, as it is kind of almost like every day. So you almost don't see it. So, and it's like, well, and that for me is really interesting, and I think from the outset, when I started, even from the opera projects and the picnic, I think for me, the work exists in the, it kind of exists as a story and as a memory of in a place. And I think that's fine. I think that's for me, that's as important. It is important that those things exist. And I've had critics. I've had people who have kind of not kind of struggle with the work, which is fine. And it's part of again, it's part of the work.
It's part of existing.
Yeah.
Well, it's part of being alive, I guess.
Exactly. And I try and as I said, I try and talk to as many people as I possibly can in order to make the work kind of as porous as possible. And essentially, and as such, I think the works I'm producing, as I'm getting older, they're getting a lot more kind of tuned. They're tuning in. It's like a tuning of the way that I work and the way that I kind of see and act in the world. But but it's also, I know that it's a very privileged position, and and I know that it's I'm very fortunate in that space, and I don't take it for granted. Every opportunity, every work that I've been commissioned for, I've done everything as much as I possibly can to make sure that the work works. And is working for the commissioners, but at the same time is working for a public, and that testing in the real world, that bristle, that kind of tension that exists between a work and the real world, and the working in the public space, I think is really important, because it kind of, I don't know how to describe it really, but it's an important part of how we live in a city or in an urban environment or in architecture, is that if it's stuck and it's static, we disconnect in some respects. And I think that idea of an event of how an architecture can be reciprocal, this idea of something that's back and forth, it means that in some respects, architecture, space, time, all these things start to become a lot more tangible and therefore far more meaningful for us. And in some respects, elongate their value and why things need to operate. And I think the other thing is, though, more so in the last couple of years, I think a lot of the work that I've been producing and the last kind of 5 years or so, I think, has been that there's been this narrative because I use everyday objects, and I like to use everyday objects and the identities and stories that are associated with them into my work. There is this potential for the work to then live on through, in some respects afterwards, through donation or through loaning of the objects or whatever. And I think it happened in a project in Hastings and in St Leonard's, and the work itself was made from rubber mats and such. And then then a local arts organisation then took responsibility for those mats and used them in their own kind of events and stuff afterwards. And so in some respects, the work.
And what was the project? What was the project?
So the St Leonard's Foundry was the project, and essentially it was a public sculpture in a memoir space, and it was there for, I think, for 2-3 months, and essentially I also produced a publication where I then collaborated with Camberwell Press, which is a kind of graphic design kind of organization, and which then had an essay and then a map and then a series of postcards, which would then encourage people to then kind of have a wander around and find history. And I was very clear that the publication had to be a newsprint and that it had to be recyclable, and that there were and I gave a public talk with a local historical group and St Bernard's Burton St Leonard's Conservation Society, and I think, and that was in a local church, in a Gilbert Scott church and stuff. So there's all these kind of stories of layers and layers and layers, which is all, it's critical to the work, but because we're living in it, but the work is the main sculpture then had another life afterwards, and so then and so therefore it really did disintegrate. The work itself disintegrated into, and it became useful in other ways. And so, and I've now, I try to do that as much as as possible. I try to integrate that idea of a work existing beyond itself in other ways. And so, in some respects, this, suddenly a rubber mat is embodied with this story, but at the same time, it exists through another contemporary life. And so, there's this kind of overlap between how we, and I think and for me, it's an environmental way of thinking. It's like it's the idea of a landscape constantly changing and evolving. And it's a similar way you could say it's the same as architecture, in the fact that the minute a building is finished, actually it starts to age. And so there, in some respects, we're trying to kind of keep it alive as long as possible. So there's this kind of, and in some respects, by donating and in some respects, it starts to, the idea of where and how art, design, architecture begins and starts becomes a lot more blurred for me, and I think that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's about the blurring of time, I guess, the fact that it transforms. So there must be a map that you start with. There must be a kind of, because there are all these fragments that somehow form a project. Each project is a series of little fragments, right?
Yeah.
An essay, a poster, a sculpture.
Yeah. I mean,
a voice recording. There was a.
Yeah. I mean, I imagine it as a constellation. So it's like a kind of, and stories and places exist through many kind of different ways of, they exist in lots of different ways for different times and different forms. So I resource postcards, I look at historical archives, I dig about, literally digging, I sometimes dig, and I look at the earth and all this kind of stuff, but at the same time, I'm looking around at, signage changing on, just how, small fixes happen in buildings, and then graffiti, and and it's just all, it's all these different layers, and they just I don't know, through digging and sieving, it starts to materialize into a work, into a story which is interconnected. And so
I guess you're also the channeling device. You yourself become the channeling device of all these fragments.
I've never really thought about it too much like this, but yes, I suppose. But I don't go into a project going, yeah, that's what it's going to be. I think there's a process and there's a conversation with a place. And that's essentially what I hope the work lives as, which is an open conversation. So, and I think that's for me, that's the key. And sometimes I get there was one work.
There was one work that involved the piano. Can you remind me?
Yep. So that was in Derry, Londonderry. Yeah. It was a project for these. I think it's Centre for Contemporary Art in Londonderry, Derry, and essentially it was a part of a series of kind of short commissions, I suppose, and I created an event inside the gallery, which was to celebrate the 40th birthday of Dopey Dick, the whale who got lost down the River Foyle in the 1980s. And it was an important story because essentially this lost orca, I think it was an orca, yeah, it was a whale, became a story of bringing people together, essentially. So it was a critical point in the history of Northern Ireland, and the fact that the Troubles, and so therefore there's a lot of significant and painful volume of division, and so the whale came for a week or so, and essentially everybody just crowded to come and look at it, to come and watch it, and to and so I created this kind of party in a gallery, and I created a wallpaper, a print wallpaper, which reproduced the structure of the pattern of the Craigavon Bridge, which is one of the key points across the River Foyle where you could view the river, which was scaled up to such a point that, so it's kind of scaled up to the point where if you were a child,
and the whale was presumably observed.
Yeah, so the way there was a wavy pattern to it, and so essentially it made adults children, essentially, because it was scaled up. And so actually these were 45, 50-year-old, the people were coming who were then children when they saw that whale. So there was this kind of, and they had brought their children to the event. And so there's this kind of interesting storytelling that going on within that. And then there was a table of all of these papers that were piled up, which then allowed, it encouraged, invited people to kind of make sailor hats out of paper, and then, give it a little dink at the back so it kind of matched the Dopey Dick's cut in his fin, and so there's this kind of little moment of making, so everyone's wandering around with the hats on, and then I invited got myself a piano, a upright piano loaned from the local theatre up the road, and we all pushed it up the hill, got it into the gallery, and I commissioned a local pianist to come and play Fingal's Cave, Mendelssohn's Fingal's Cave, and for the duration of the installation. And essentially, that what was interesting about that is that it's a kind of well-known tune, but it's also an indicator of basically the whale still lives, but is living in Scotland now. So, and is one of the last surviving whales in a particular pod of whales in the Hebrides. So, and then in the other room there was this one-to-one, huge projection across the whole wall of a live webcam from that lake where he now lives. So there was this kind of and at the same time I did these hydroscopic recordings from the River Foyle. So you were hearing the River Foyle, but you were looking at, so there's this kind of schizophrenic quality about it. And then there was a wall of newspaper cuttings from the time that I'd found in the archive, alongside a computer. So it's a kind of research center kind of area, part of it, where there was short films, interviews from public archives. And then there was a table with ginger beer. And I commissioned, I think one of the gallery assistants to make a tray bake, which was to match the muddiness of the River Foyle. So in some respects, you're eating. It was like the idea of eating and celebrating the whale by kind of, in some respects, becoming a whale. And it was like this really tasty, an amazing tasty banana bread kind of bake. And so you get this kind of, so it was like you're drinking ginger beer and bread, and it was just, and so all these things were happening all at the same time in the space, and it was just a moment. It was a couple of days, but it was really enjoyable. And again, it's just all these different entry points and different ways of.
What this makes me think, in respect to your work, is that you're also a bit of a curator, and you've never really used that. You've never really used that word.
No.
The word just suddenly comes to mind, even though it's a word that's been overused, I guess.
I think that maybe is my. I've got all these labels. I just think another one is just going to make my head explode. I don't know, but to be honest,
well, just get rid of all of them.
That's why I just do it, and then. And I hope that as I said, I just hope that the conversation is open enough to keep people talking. I think that's, and just to kind of, I don't know, trigger some, to get some memories, or remind people of things that they perhaps forgotten or they didn't know, or way of being. All of these things are fantastic, and I'm always overwhelmed by how people respond to the work, because I don't really, because
you never know.
Yeah, it's this constellation. You're never really not sure what's going to stick and what's going to, how. But for me, that's the architecture of it. That's all these bits, these kind of moments. They're important. They're important for how we. For a complicated, complex life, it's different viewpoints, all that kind of stuff. It's really important. Yeah.
There is one final thing that, we can go on for hours, but there's one final thing that I want to kind of attribute to your work, and that is maybe the educational aspect of it. That then obviously then bridges over to your teaching and to your calling as a teacher. But there is also that kind of educational quality within each of your, let's call them, artworks.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there is a strong overlap, and I'm very aware of that, of the two. And I don't actively seek to be careful, but I do try to not be too didactic in the way that my works exist. There's a quality of, there's a quality in terms of how, there's a looseness to the way that the works exist, which allows for that porosity where the work itself will emerge from itself or with the space it's with, and that's that. And I don't try and kind of say, well, that's the way I thought it was going to be, because invariably it never is. But within education, I think there are these kind of, there are these things that you need to do and think about, and I try my best to.
even in the this unraveling of information and archives, and there is something, there is an educational aspect to what you present to the public.
Yeah.
Almost as a way of educating the public through your work.
I don't see the work.
That's not. No.
I don't think I see it as. I see it more as an experience than that, and then an education, I think.
Right.
But I can. But equally, I mean, if it is, then it is. I'm not gonna. Yes. I'm not gonna.
But it's not an intention. Well, it's not an intention of it.
No.
Yeah.
It's in some respects, I'm trying to. It's a conversation about a way of being, and a way of engaging with the world and seeing space.
If it was an intention, it could come across as patronizing, but it doesn't come across as patronizing. So in that sense, maybe the intention really isn't that, but it's just something that one can take from it. In a couple of conversations I've had with some artists and people associated with various, or formerly associated with various institutions, there's been a lot of talk about the role of an institution. You directed the spatial design course at the Chelsea School of Art. So you were in that kind of leadership position at an educational institution.
I think for me, I think for the 8 years I was course leader, I think one of my ambitions was that it would encourage individuality, but at the same time a collective ambition of change, of how we responsibly design and how we take responsibility for our own actions. But at the same time, I think it was very important that conversation was grounded in a reality, in an everyday, but at the same time as that, it was also plural, in that it enabled different and difficult conversations to take place that would progress a way of thinking and acting in the world beyond the institution. And I think that's an important. It's an important structure, but I think as we move into this online world, and however an educational context lives on, I think all of those things will continue, but at the same time, I think they will evolve through technology, and our attitude and our relationship to technology.
And hopefully they will allow for ways of discourse that are not, well, there's nothing for them to allow, but hopefully the awareness of ability of an individual to lead their own discourse will emerge as a consequence. That we don't need to rely on institutions to give us green light to do anything or to be in a particular type of conversation, but we can kind of have those conversations regardless. I certainly hope that will be one of those major changes that we're talking about.
I talk about my work with students, and equally, I think the opportunities to lecture and talk about my work also then enables me to have a reflection on what it is that I actually do in practice. So there is this, again, it's that reciprocal back and forth that makes the work that I enjoy, reflexivity, I think that's called, isn't it? So yeah.
And there is a kind of edge quality. There is that kind of edgy quality, edgy meaning edge between fields, writing, architecture, art, graphic design. Also maybe generate a thought about the profession, the architectural profession, which, we haven't really spoken about it, but, or we have, in different terms to what one would expect to hear. You also might be engaged in trying to rethink the role of the profession.
I think in the early days, I was, I quite enjoyed that nebulous, this kind of flexible position and that question mark. The identity, the profession of an architect can live in many ways, and I think that's exciting as a prospect. And I think in the last few years, I think a lot more. I think London Festival of Architecture in particular and things, they kind of encouraged a much more kind of stronger sense of plurality in terms of how an architecture or an object or a story can exist. And I think, I remember, when I did the picnic project, which is again the early days of London Festival of Architecture, they were critical in terms of how young people could engage and test ideas in a way that had traction and ways to, and there was a great support there, and it existed for a number of years, and then it kind of dipped a bit, and then Tamsin Thompson took over, and suddenly, and now in the last few years, London Festival of Architecture has become, it's getting loud, it's got this kind of strength behind it. I was part of a Waltham Forest project, and I think and it's great, and I think that's really exciting, and it holds, and I think you're seeing a lot more younger practices kind of questioning and challenging the boundaries of what architecture and spatial design and product and theatre and image making and writing and film and all of these things. And I think it's fantastic. It's absolutely fantastic, because architecture exists in all this kind of breadth, and this is important because architecture is more than just a building.
That's where maybe the courses such as a spatial design course become quite important. In the educational landscape, there isn't this supremacy of architecture course as a kind of the top of the food chain, but there are many other ways in which you can question built environment or contribute to it.
And I think, to be honest, there's a place for all of it. I think it's important that all of these conversations are being had. It's a bit, for me, it's also important that there's a kind of a sensitivity to those different perspectives, and that everybody